Hey.
How you doing?
Good.
Good.
So what do you have? Give us your ray of optimism. Or first of all, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Damion Thomas. I am a historian and the curator of sports for the recently opened Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Outstanding.
Thank you. Thank you.
Outstanding. So what's your ray of light?
Well, I'm going to go straight to optimism. I'm not going into
All right.
I am optimistic because athletes are protesting. Athletes are standing up and they're socially engaged. And whether you agree with their political stances, it's very important because what it shows is that they've bought into these American ideals, these ideals of freedom, justice, and equality for all, the idea that America is a place where everybody should be equal before the law. Mm-hmm. And so the ways that people like Colin Kaepernick have sacrificed in order to draw attention to a political issue is very important. And I think it's important to note that athletes don't start social revolution. They respond to them. Mm-hmm. And it's the people in the streets that motivate them and cause them to think about how can we get involved. And so what athletes do most effectively is to nationalize these conversations which are often happening on the margins. And I began to see this when I was a young boy. I began to notice that sports was frequently my entryway into larger political, national, cultural, and social conversations. And so the fact that athletes have moved from a position of being apathetic to being engaged makes me optimistic.
So just as a historian, why don't you just chart the arc for us? Because, you know, it feels like the activism maybe comes in waves, or that's what's happening now is significant because it does represent a bit of a reversal maybe of not immediately recent history, but kind of when I was growing up, I was kind of Michael Jordan was the touchstone and kind of famously resisted getting drawn into politics. So is that the correct reading of history, that what's happening right now is kind of a significant moment because it represents at least a break with the immediate past? Or?
I think that's absolutely right, that this history is important because it speaks to a re-energizing of social activism, not just among athletes, but among other people. And one of the things that we know about social revolutions and social engagement is that it's contagious.
Yes.
The same way that people in the streets for Black Lives Matter have been inspired by the LGBT community. Now we're seeing people discuss sexual harassment in the workplace, that we're all better when people are taking a stance, and you begin to see these movements sort of feed off of each other.
And then what is the impact that has on society? So it sounds like what you're describing is social protest happens outside of sports, then it kind of moves into sports, and then what happens in terms of how does it affect society?
Well, in terms of the contemporary moment, one of the things that happens is that it nationalizes the conversation. But then what has to happen in turn, once athletes become engaged, people have to begin to take that space, that nationalized conversation, and do something with it. Social movements are not inevitable. Progress is not inevitable. And that's an interesting point, because if you think about American history, there is no more important concept in terms of how we think about who we are than the notion of progress, that things are always getting better, but they don't. Sometimes they get better, sometimes they get worse. And the moment that we're in is we're trying to figure out what's gonna happen next. I heard someone say recently that Colin Kaepernick is the Rosa Parks of today. Who knows? It depends on what happens next. If nothing happens next, then he'll be forgotten in 10 years.
I mean, I feel like this actually connects to the discussion about climate change in a weird way, and maybe even the discussion about technology we were just having, in that it feels like what happens is that human beings in the face of massive problems there is this kind of natural inertia that we have where we kind of don't think that we have agency in the face of something that's so big and imposing as climate change or white supremacy or whatever it is. And then there are these moments where we wake up and we realize, holy cow, as humans, we actually have incredible power.
And this is why history is so important. I remember why I became a historian. I ended up taking this course. It was colonial history. It was 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And when I signed up for it, I was like, oh my God, this is the worst decision I've ever made. But on the very first day of class, this is what the professor said. He said, whoever controls the present will use their power to control the past in hopes of controlling the future. One more time. Whoever controls the present will use their power to control the past in hopes of controlling the future. And I was like, wait a minute. History is not a bunch of facts and figures. History is about power. And the way that history is traditionally used is to normalize and to naturalize our current moment. History is often used to make us think that the way things are was inevitable, that this was the only way, that these social processes couldn't be any other way. And that's why I think it's important that people have to think about history in new ways, because history is not about the past, it's about the present and the future. And I'll give you a great example. This speaks to that's going on right now. Our national conversation about civil rights, about Confederate monuments has nothing to do with the Civil War. It has nothing to do with the 1960s when most of them were put up. It's about our contemporary moment and what's acceptable discourse and dialogue about race and inequality in this country. That's a contemporary moment. That has nothing to do with the past.
So I want to ask a couple questions just about athletes as agents of change. The first is, I kind of always have Charles Barkley in my ears, where he said, "I'm not a role model," which this question of how much responsibility do athletes as a matter of kind of a political and moral question. What is the responsibility of the professional athlete?
I think to piggyback up this Charles Barkley, I think Charles Barkley was absolutely right, because what he was saying is, I am 6'4", I lead the NBA in rebounding, I'm 300 pounds, I can slam dunk, I'm one of the 10 best players in the world. The likelihood that you can be me is slim to none. Is that you shouldn't try to become me. The role models are your family and people in your community. So I think he's right in that regard. But on the same hand, is that when you walk down a path, you never know what's gonna inspire somebody. You never know what action you're gonna take is gonna be the one that someone says, wow, that's really significant, that's really, really important. And so you never know when you're being a role model.
Right. So what about the way in which professional sports is really a microcosm of social problems? I mean, I look at the NFL protests, and there was that kind of awkward moment where the owners had to decide what they were going to do in response to their talent protesting. And it kind of in stark relief, you saw that you had a league of white owners, and then you had players who were, I don't know what the balance is, but maybe, certainly racially mixed, to say the least. And so many African American stars. It feels like there's a way in which professional sports is not divorced from everything that we're talking about in society, but that it kind of in some ways can be a distillation of it.
Certainly, sports are always politicized. One of the things that makes sports such an important form of messaging is that people don't often realize the messaging that's taking place through sports. And because so many of us love sports and are positively predisposed to sports, we don't think about that socializing that's take place until some people began to insert sort of politics which aren't normally there into that space. And I think one of the things that's important is that people often sort of disassociate athletes from the larger communities that they're involved in. The fact that you play basketball doesn't mean that you're not a son, that you're not a cousin, that you're not a friend to people who are dealing with a whole host of
Why do
issues
we tend to do that, do you think?
I think we tend to think that money matters more than anything else. And that's not true. And you can see that in the lives of a number of people and what it is that they become. We think money solves all problems, and it just simply doesn't.
So if you were to, as a historian, I'm going to ask you two questions. One is, what would you assign, in terms of assigned reading, if there's one figure from history or one moment from history that illustrates your thesis best, what would you kind of assign everybody to, Professor, what would you assign everybody to look at?
I don't know that you can do that because different people are going to have different entry points. And so what you want to do is give people a variety of things. You want to give people some you want to give people some novels, you want to give them some visual text. One of the things I think particularly when you think about students of today is that, and I was recently a college professor, I just recently left the university, is I think, you talk about the book, I think at universities we have fetishized the book and the written text, that this is what you have to do. You have to read this book, you need to read these articles. My last couple of years, I started to get rid of the text, and what we did is we watched videos, we looked at memes, and what we did is we read these media texts, and it was what students were consuming on a daily basis as a way of entering these sort of conversations.
Well, let me put it differently. So as a curator of a museum, is there an artifact that to you personally you find most inspiring in the history of sports as a vehicle for social protest?
Man, now you're asking me to pick my favorite items.
No, the most inspiring item.
The most inspiring for me, which can be very different.
Yeah, no, it's a personal thing.
Than someone else.
Yeah.
I met with Brianna Scurry, who was the goalie of the 1999 U.S. women's soccer team.
Yeah.
And we collected some items from her. And as I was explaining to her why I wanted to put her items into the museum, she just kind of looked up and said, and I thought I was just playing a game. And sometimes people don't realize their impact and don't realize the significance of their contributions. And being in a position where I can chronicle that and situate, celebrate and situate the contributions of sports is very inspiring to me.
No, that's beautiful. So as you watch this moment, and as now that you're a curator, and you're thinking about the artifacts that you'd want to place in a museum, and as you watch things happen, I know it's too soon probably to know, we don't know how the story is going to end, we don't know how significant this is, but surely as you watch events happen, you must look and say, I would die to have that in the museum. I would die to have that in the museum. How do I start to kind of figure out how to get a hold of this or that? What are you looking at right now as you see the world unfold that you think, I just have this gut sense that this is going to be important?
Well, you know, one of the challenges, sometimes you have to be creative and you have to be flexible. And so certainly the protests among the athletes is something that we're keeping a tremendous eye on right now.
And I'm just curious, as museum curator, how do you have to, oh, end of conversation.
Man.
No. We're just getting started. I'm just going to stay. This is my means of protesting.
Thank you so much.